So, James, the US has passed another milestone. We've hit 37 trillion in national debt now. And I guess the big question is, does it matter that it's 37 trillion as opposed to 36.9 trillion?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a convenient milestone because it has a lot of zeros. I mean, they used to do this. I remember when they used to do this when the debt hit, 7 trillion, 8 trillion, 10 trillion, 12 trillion. But now it happens, every trillion it just happens so quickly now that most of the time these milestones aren't even really commemorated anymore. But
Are we
you're
going to do
right.
it
I mean,
several times a year instead of every
well,
few years? So it
yeah,
used
you
to
have
be.
to. Yeah, you have to. Now you have to do it basically roughly, every 5 months, every 4 or 5 months, you have to do another. Hey, we just had another $1 trillion added to the national debt. But it's not. It's the interesting thing is it's not just the gross number right now. It's how quickly it's growing. And part of this was, in fairness, part of this was kind of pent up. They hit the debt ceiling several months ago. And then the Treasury Department resorts to what they call extraordinary measures to kind of manage the debt. And then once they pass the, OBB, whatever, the OBBBBB, the one big beautiful bill thing on July 4th, part of the one big beautiful bill increased the debt ceiling. And so basically overnight, you had a couple $100 billion increase. So a lot of that was like pent up debt that hadn't actually been fully recorded on the books over the previous couple of months. But after that kind of initial surge where they said, okay, we're going to record this debt, there was still about $500 billion in new spending and fresh spending just over the last basically month. Okay, so in a month, you had the total increase to the debt was $800 billion in roughly a month since the one big beautiful bill was passed on July 4th. So that's astonishing. Let's say 250, 300 billion of that was that sort of pent up increase in the debt. But there's at least $500 billion or so in new debt. So I mean, it's an incredible, it's whatever adjective, superlative you want to use. I mean, it's really astonishing to see how quickly the debt is rising, and it is rising really, really, really fast. And of course, along with that, because it's not just the number, it's not just the debt, it's not 37 trillion that really matters. It's how much it costs to service that debt. It's the interest on that debt that costs so much. And that's really what's rising right now. If you go back even just a couple of years, it wasn't really that long ago, the sort of, let's say the interest, the total annual interest expense as a percentage of tax revenue was like 15%. I mean, it was pretty manageable. I mean, you can go back, in the past, in the 2010s, you start seeing numbers 12, 13, 14% interest in terms of the interest, the annual interest bill on the national debt relative to federal government tax revenue. Today, it's like 21, 22% for fiscal year 25. There's still a couple of months to go in fiscal year 25. So we have to see sort of what the actual, total revenue take will be, et cetera. But I mean, it's most likely going to be, well over 20%. And so that's the thing that's actually really troubling. It's that increase in the interest expense as a percentage of tax revenue. So essentially, of all the tax revenue the government collects, more and more and more of that every year goes just to pay interest, right? So that number is growing every year. That slice of the pie, if you look at the budget like a pie chart. The other slices, of course, that are growing is Medicare and Social Security. So if you look at just those three slices in the federal budget, interest on the debt, Medicare, Social Security, the mandatory entitlements, that consumes 100% of tax revenue already. So all of discretionary spending, the military, Homeland Security, all these sorts of things that we think about, the national parks, all that stuff, all that has to be financed with more debt because they're spending 100% of tax revenue just to pay interest and the mandatory entitlement. So it's a pretty serious problem. And, interest is just, it just leads the way. And one of these, when you can see another like, okay, 36 trillion, 37 trillion, soon it'll be 38 trillion. I mean, it's just these times to really sit back and go, wow, is anybody actually taking this problem seriously? Is anybody actually doing anything about this? And for the best we can see, absolutely not.
Well, and the interesting thing about interest as well is that obviously the Trump administration doesn't want to touch Social Security or Medicare. They're not going to say, here's where the savings is going to be. It's this big $1 trillion interest bill every year to say, let's wipe that off the table. Who does that benefit? And so what they want to do is take interest rates down, and they want to be able to do that through the Federal Reserve, right? They kind of want this magic touch to be able to eliminate that $1 trillion and spend it on other things, or just have it not continue accumulating the debt.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's clearly the plan. This isn't some wild conspiracy theory. They've articulated this in public. The Treasury Secretary said about a month and a half ago, it was this summer, and the Treasury Secretary came out publicly and said, we're going to get interest rates down. We got to get interest rates down. I mean, this is no conspiracy theory. The Treasury Secretary of the United States of America has been very clear about their intent to get interest rates down. I mean, he said, what we're going to do is we're going to get in there and we're going to start moving these rates down. And when he says we're going to get in there, he's talking about inside the Federal Reserve. So they're basically articulating a strategy where they want to effectively have a coup. They want to hijack the Fed, take over the Fed, because the Fed is the primary interest rate setting body, interest rate setting institution in the United States. That's at least what they think. We talked about, I think, in a previous podcast, where the Fed actually has a lot less power than most people believe in the market. The bond market has, most of the power here. It's ultimately up to the bond market. It's up to investors, ultimately, in terms of especially long-term rates. The Fed has a lot of influence over short-term rates. And so the Trump administration has this, they've been very articulate about this plan to say, we want to take over, we want to get in the Fed, and they've been trying it. You have the president of the United States who's been out there bullying the chairman of the Fed. Too late, Jerome Powell, he's an incompetent buffoon. And again, I am no fan of the Fed. I am no fan of Jerome Powell. I always have to caveat my remarks and say this. I mean, these guys have been, they've been late at every turn. They've shown that they've been asleep at the wheel. They had a major ethics scandal where you had, Fed officials that were trading stocks that they were benefiting from by setting Fed policy. They completely missed inflation. They completely missed the banking crises. I mean, all this stuff the Fed as an institution has been really, at a minimum, asleep at the wheel. That puts it politely. I think more bluntly, they have been incompetent. They have completely missed so many different things. I think there's probably some very intelligent people in that institution, but for whatever reason, they've just missed it. They've just missed it. And so, so I have to say this, but at the same time, I don't think I think interest rates should be set by the market, not by any institution. And I certainly don't think it should be set by the White House or by the Treasury Department. And yet they've been very vocal in saying, we're going to get in the Fed. We're going to bring interest rates down. And so what happened? Just last week, while, we basically shut down our organization for a week, sent everybody on vacation. Sure enough, that was the week that you had a key Fed official resign, and with no notice. Just one day, she's like, I'm out, I quit, with almost immediate effect, with no explanation, by the way. Just said, I'm out, I'm going back. She said, well, I'll probably end up back at Georgetown, to teach at some point down the road. But there's no explanation about why I'm leaving. And usually they have some BS, for personal reasons, or the best part is I want to spend more time with my family, or this kind of thing. But there was no explanation at all, really.
You think there was some behind the scenes stuff to try to bully her out or something?
To be honest, my first thought was this woman maybe saw the writing on the wall and just didn't want to be any part of it. Either she saw hey, this institution is about to get hijacked by the White House and I want to be long gone by the time that happens, or she just saw the trajectory of the debt in the United States, saw the impossible position that the Federal Reserve was going to be put in, seeing that geez, if we don't cut rates, eventually the Treasury Department is going to default because they just won't be able to pay the debt. They won't be able to pay interest on the debt anymore. And so we're going to have to print lots of money to bail them out. And that's going to create inflation. All these consequences. And I don't want to have anything to do with this. I mean, I've said this before, whoever runs for president in 2032 is a crazy person. Whoever signs up to be Treasury Secretary in 2032, after the 2032 election, is a crazy person, right? Because you're going to get hit with potentially one of the worst financial crises in the history of the world. And you're probably going to take the blame for it because, most people don't understand the nature and how it was built up over decades. So you got to be a crazy person. So maybe this Fed official said, you know what, I'm out. I don't want to be blamed for this. I don't want to have anything to do with whatever the reason. She's out. So what happened? I mean, within hours, the Trump administration said, we got a replacement. We're putting Stephen Moran in office to fill her vacant post. Stephen Moran, of course, is the guy who is the key architect behind the entire Trump administration economic agenda. This guy's fingerprints are everywhere. And, kudos to him, because nobody had ever heard the name Stephen Moran up until basically right after the election last year. And then this guy writes this piece, in a way, kind of kissing Trump's ass, calls for this economic agenda that he basically called, quote, the Mar-a-Lago Accords, and made this whole case for tariffs and all this sort of stuff. And, Trump saw this and said, that's my guy. And overnight, this guy got propelled to the key inner circle within Trump's economic advisors. And now he's going to be on the Federal Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve, essentially setting interest rate policy for the United States and for the US dollar. It also means that next year, this guy could be nominated because Jerome Powell, current chairman of the Federal Reserve, his term is going to be up as Fed chairman. And so the Trump administration is going to get to appoint a new Fed chairman to replace Jerome Powell, which could end up being Stephen Moran. And so they'll end up getting more and more seats on the Fed.
Do they pick from among the people usually that are on that already have
they
a
can.
seat, or
yeah, they absolutely can.
Or would they even want him in there as one of the voting members, since it's not just the chair that makes that decision? Are they just trying to beef up the whole panel?
That's the whole point. That's the whole point. If you wanted to sort of take control of the Fed, you would look and say, okay, who's on the Federal Open Market Committee? Who's going to be on because the Federal Open Market Committee, which is ultimately who decides, the body that decides what they're going to do with interest rates, whether or not they're going to, print money and have what they call open market operations and buying and selling bonds. There's certain members that are permanent members of that committee. There's certain that are rotating members of that committee. But the point is, they would look at the members of the committee, current members and future members, and they would say, all right, who's my guy? Who's, of this committee? And they already know that, right? They'll look and say, okay, we like this person, we like this person, we like this person. These people on the committee are clearly for cutting interest rates. These people on the committee are clearly for printing money. So they look at all the people on this committee and they'd say, okay, who's on our side? And then how many more people do we need to put on the committee in order to make that happen? So we know it's like, okay, we just got one, for free, basically, with a resignation with immediate effect of a Fed official. Next year, we've got Jerome Powell. Then you got other people that are going to end up retiring. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if there were more sudden resignations. I mean, it's politics. It's a dirty business. Is there going to be, some nasty news coming out about, there's going to be some kind of some interest rate hawk who likes higher rates, who doesn't want to print money, and all of a sudden that person, they find they found drugs in his car or whatever. List. Yeah, he's not right. He was on Epstein's list, right? That person's on Epstein's list. They set him up in a hooker sting. I mean, all kinds of stuff, right? That they do when they just want to get rid of people. I wouldn't be surprised to see that with some Fed officials who have a firm stance, in favor of keeping interest rates high. And I think I think it's possible you see this. I don't know they'll have to resort to that, but I think you'll eventually get to a point where you see more and more Fed officials capitulate, say, all right, let's cut rates. Fine, we'll cut rates. And I think that it's clearly what the White House wants. It's what the Treasury Department needs, because when you're spending over $1 trillion a year just to pay interest on the national debt, I mean, I get it, right? You've got to do everything in your power to try and move interest rates down, even, and this is why these guys think, let's just hijack the Fed. Let's take control of the Fed's Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC. Let's put our guys on the FOMC so that we know that we can move interest rates down. And this is not some wild conspiracy theory, because the Treasury Secretary of the United States basically said this about a month and a half ago. So this is not any crazy idea. This is what they're telling us they want to do. And now they just happen to put the key architect of the entire Trump administration economic agenda now and appointed this person to fill a vacant seat on the Federal Reserve, which just happened to get resigned with no explanation and no advance notice last week. I mean, come on. You don't have to be a PhD in economics to see what's happening here. So this is clearly seems to be a takeover of the Fed, clearly with the intent to move interest rates lower, which they clearly need to do because the interest bill is already over $1 trillion a year and more than 20% of federal tax revenue.
And what's the alternative? If the leftists had got in, would they just be raising taxes to try to cover this extra, to try to close the gap? Because they obviously, the Trump administration passed the tax cuts, and so they're clearly want to promote the economy in some way. So this seems like one of the crazy things that starts happening when you reach the end of the rope trying to solve this problem that's clearly out of control.
Yeah, it's kind of philosophical. It's not, but people look at it like a philosophical issue, and they kind of look at it, approach it from two sides. And the two sides are, they say, we have a revenue problem. We need to raise revenue by increasing taxes, always on the rich, on the billionaires, et cetera. It starts off obviously with the billionaires, and then they get to the rich, and then they get to the upper middle class. And so, they continue to expand that net wider and wider to ensnare more people in it.
I think Elizabeth Warren's gone from the 0.2%. Now she's already at 25%. The top.
Yeah, we got the top 25%, I mean, it's ridiculous. The other side of the coin is people say, well, we have a spending problem and we got to cut spending. And the reality is, Robert Kiyosaki, he used to tell me, he said, well, people say there's two sides to, on the coin. He said, there's not, there's always a third side. And the third side, you got the heads, you got the tails, but you also have the edge. And he said, you always kind of want to look at the edge, very closely. And the edge of the coin in this case is you could look at it from a spending problem. You could look at it from a revenue problem, but you also have to look at it from, The third approach is that you just have a blatant mismanagement problem, because there's so much bloat, there's so much waste, there's so much fraud, and they bake that stuff into the budget every single year. Every single year, they go, okay, here's a department that has $100 billion budget. And out of that $100 billion budget, 25, 30% of it is wasted. And yet next year, this same department's going to get like $110 billion budget, which takes all the 25, $30 billion in waste and just, and we're being generous when we say it's only 25 or $30 billion. And they're going to bake that in and probably add to it even more. And so, there's kind of a simple concept in that's called zero-based budgeting, where basically every department, every agency, every office starts off at zero. Says your budget for this year is zero. Now go and justify every single thing, every single penny, every single dollar, every single program that you need. And, let's assess and figure it out and see if we really need it or not. See if this actually, validates some basic standards of whether or not there's return on investment for taxpayers. And if the answer is no, then we're not going to do it. And so these are, it's just like a revolutionary concept for the U.S. government. But I mean, it's a pretty simple thing. I mean, like, most people don't look at their like credit card statement every month and just kind of assume like, well, this is what it's going to be, every single month. Like, most people are like, you're like looking for like, okay, gee, well, turns out I don't need like 18 different, whatever, Netflix subscriptions and, all these different things. Maybe I'm going to cut some of these things, whatever. That's not like most people do, but this is a revolutionary concept for the federal government. So, the leftists do look at it from the revenue side, and the people on the right pretend that they want to do something about spending, but of course they had every opportunity to do so with the One Big Beautiful Bill, and they didn't. The One Big Beautiful Bill added to the deficit. It ensured that there was going to be at least a $2 trillion deficit this fiscal year, next fiscal year, and so forth. They didn't cut spending. They increased spending. They had a few ceremonial cuts, but for the most part, spending went up. So they pretend that they care about cutting spending, but they don't. And on the left, they have this raging call for increasing tax revenue, and the way they want to do it is by, quote unquote, taxing the rich, taxing the billionaires, et cetera. What if they ever got into power, and I think they will, what they're going to find out very quickly is that that's not going to move the needle at all. And I went through this weekend, actually, this past weekend, I did an analysis of this, where I modeled, with a lot of help from AI, I modeled what the additional tax revenue would look like. And it's actually a relatively easy calculation, because you can look at, the IRS, you can look at this up yourself. You can see the IRS, it's called SOI, Statement of, Statistics Office or whatever. SOI is the acronym, from the Internal Revenue Service. And you can look at all the reports and you can see, here's how many taxpayers are in certain income brackets. So you can see, here's how many people make, between 1 million and 2 million, or 2 million and 5 million, 5 million and 10 million, et cetera. And you can see this. And so, they've been talking about, for example, taxing people, whatever, over who make more than $10 million. Well, there's not that many people that make more than $10 million, but I mean, people that do, there's some people that generate hundreds of millions of dollars in income. So even if you went out and said, well, let's impose a 70% marginal tax rate on people that earn more than $10 million a year, 70%, which is insane, right? That's a crazy marginal tax rate. You would generate maybe an extra $35 to $40 billion in revenue, in tax revenue, every year. And say, all right, well, let's raise even more. You can go back and see, World War II, even through the 1960s, tax rates in the U.S. were nuts, right? The highest marginal rate in the U.S., even in the 60s, was over 90%. Now, it applied to really, 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 really high income levels. I mean, talking about, people that are making millions, tens of millions of dollars a year in modern day equivalent. And bear in mind, this is the marginal tax rate, which means, let's say we apply it to the first $10 million, to $10 million. It basically means the first $10 million is subject to a lower tax rate, and only every dollar above 10 million is that 70%, 80%, 90%, 100% tax rate. The point is, you could say, all right, let's apply it to incomes over $5 million, $2 million. You could pick a number and say, let's have 90% over $5 million or 80% over $2 million. You just don't end up with that much tax revenue. You get 50 billion, 80 billion, 100 billion. $100 billion in additional tax revenue does not even cover the increase in interest on the debt next year. That's how trivial $100 billion. So it's you could go and tax the rich all you want and say, well, let's have a 90% marginal tax rate on the ultra wealthy. Let's have an 80% marginal tax rate on the merely kind of wealthy. 75% tax rate on the pretty wealthy, raise taxes on the and like the upper middle class, people that make $250,000 a year or whatever. You're just not moving the needle. You're not moving the needle. If you really want to raise tax revenue by their calculation, you'd have to have 40% plus tax rates on the middle class, which I mean personally, I don't think they're going to do that because that's politically suicidal. So this pipe dream that they have, and I mean anybody's free to do the math. You can look up the numbers yourself on the IRS SOI, the statistics. You can go back the last couple of years and see how many people are earning this much money, how many people are earning that much money. You just don't generate that much tax revenue. Anything, all right.
Even a wealth tax or something, because that's what they want to
right.
do. Just confiscate.
Let's have a wealth tax. Great. Let's have a wealth tax. Let's see. What does that look like? Fortunately, I did that calculation as well, right? So we can go and say, all right, let's tax Elon Musk's wealth. I mean, let's go and have a wealth tax. Let's take half of his wealth. Half. How much are you going to get? $100 billion, $120 billion, right? I mean, and that's a one-time thing. Like that's a wealth tax is a one-time windfall. So, okay, great. You got an extra $100 billion this year. You got an extra couple of $100 billion this year. Maybe you have all this wealth tax. So if you combine, you have a wealth tax, which is essentially an upfront one-time thing. And you have, 70%, 80% tax rates on the wealthy, on their income. What happens? You end up with, maybe a couple $100 billion upfront one time, and then an extra, 60, 70 billion, maybe let's be generous and say $100 billion a year recurring every single year after that. Does that move the needle for you? Absolutely not. And this doesn't assume, by the way, that people are going to do things to actually reduce that tax. This assumes there's no change in behavior, which is ludicrous because anytime they raise taxes, there's always changes in behavior. People go and they restructure their entire affairs, their portfolios. They do this, they do that, they do all sorts of things to try and reduce the tax. So this assumes no change in behavior. Maybe you get a couple $100 billion up front and you get about $100 billion a year if you're lucky, assuming no change in behavior, which is ludicrous. So in the end, you don't actually benefit. And oh, by the way, this also doesn't contemplate the obvious economic decline that would happen because now you're taking people that are wealthy, that are talented, that are very productive, who own things, who make investments in things, who finance startup businesses, who make loans and even if it's just nothing else, but maybe they buy treasuries, they put money in banks and the banks go and use that money to finance mortgages, which helps brings interest rate down, all those sorts of things that happen as a result of having all this money in the system. Instead, no, the government confiscates that and wastes it on stuff. And so that's really the problem. When you get to the root of the problem, is that you could go and confiscate all this money from, the rich, the wealthy, the ultra wealthy, the merely, moderately successful. You could go and kind of confiscate all this money, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem of there being a tremendous amount of waste in the federal government. It doesn't solve the problem. All that waste is still there. And until that problem is solved, you're not really going to solve the fundamental issue of all of this. And that's, I think, what people on the left don't understand, and the people on the right had every opportunity to do, and they just chose to not do it. They kind of pretend, they said, well, we're going to pass the one big beautiful bill, and then we'll, set our sights on cutting the deficit after the midterms. I mean, like, dude, how long are you going to wait to do what is necessary and cut spending? How long are you going to wait to do that? Oh, now we're going to wait till early 2027. I mean, come on, like this is a problem for now. Now you're already spending, north of 20% of tax revenue just to pay interest on the debt. This is a problem for now, not for 2026, not for 2027, not for 2028. It's a problem now, and it's just not being addressed.
And unfortunately, the most likely people to replace them would be these radical leftists who, despite how idiotic these ideas are, apparently are pretty popular among some of these circles. Just look at New York City with Mamdani. Yep. Do you think these people are going to come in and just sweep to power if inflation gets worse, if the economy doesn't get better?
Well, it's not just New York City, right? It's not just Mamdani. I mean, you've got. I mean, we did a roundup a week and a half ago. I mean, you look at these guys. I mean, just hardcore socialists who have no understanding. You've got, you got Chicago, you've got LA, you've got Seattle, you've got. I mean, the guy who just won the Democrat Party equivalent there primary. I mean, this guy makes Mamdani in New York look like the second coming of Milton Friedman. I mean, it's the Somali Muslim guy. I mean, it's actually crazy what's happening across American cities. And I think ultimately the issue is, since you basically only have like two parties in the U.S., if one party's in power, if they don't get it right and people don't feel like there's any improvement in their situation, they go to the other guys, and they just sort of flip flop back and forth. You see a lot of countries. There's a lot of countries where there's been one party in control for like decades. And there are a lot of countries where that's the case. The US is not one of the countries. They just sort of flip flop. I mean, in my lifetime, the longest I've seen one party in control was 12 years. It was 8 years of Reagan and 4 years of George H.W. Bush. Then you had 8 years of Clinton, 8 years of George W. Bush, 8 years of Obama, 4 years of Trump, 4 years of Biden. Now we got 4 more years of Trump, and then we'll see what happens. And, it's been like that for a really long time. It's been like that for a really long time. I think that Americans, voters do tend to kind of like flip flop from one party to the next. And so my concern is that, like after this is over in 2028, if what we're talking about, this actually happens, you talk about continuing rise, this trajectory of the debt keeps going up, interest payments on the debt keep going up. It crowds out all this other spending. You end up with, if they take over, if they're successful in taking over the Fed ends up printing a lot of money, bringing interest rates down, but the consequence of that is going to be a lot of inflation. And so people are going to feel it. They're going to blame the people in charge now. They're going to go to the other party. And you might have some extremely articulate socialist who says, yeah, we want to, we're going to do these things. We're going to give you free this and free that and all this sort of stuff. And, the problem, Margaret Thatcher once said, the problem with socialism is sooner or later you run out of other people's money. I would say the problem with socialism, the problem with people that want to seize the means of production is that the people who want to seize the means of production have never produced anything. They never act, like these guys have never actually run a business. They've never started a business. They've never actually had to manage anything. These guys have basically been activists for their entire lives. Their entire job in life is to bitch and moan and whine about stuff, as opposed to actually build something, hire people, create, innovate, do something valuable. They've never done anything like that before. So they say, a guy who's never owned a business before says, I want to seize the means of production. That is goddamn terrifying. But this is the problem with socialism, is that always the people want to seize the means of production are people who have no experience with producing anything at all whatsoever. And my concern is that, as American voters tend to flip-flop from one group to the next, that might be the group that they flip-flop to, whether it's 2028 or 2032. You get somebody that's hardcore on the left who thinks that, the solution is give everybody free stuff and tax the rich. And free stuff is just a lot more expensive, and taxing the rich, as we've demonstrated, you might get an extra $100 billion a year. But in terms of the magnitude of the problem, it doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of solving the problem.
And yet you're not defeatist. I know you talk about that there are still ways to solve this problem. And in fact, you were telling me that it's been done in the past and that there's a pretty easy framework.
Yeah, this is not rocket science. You don't need a PhD in economics to understand this. The U.S. has been in this position before. The U.S. right now is spending, again, let's say 22% of tax revenue just to pay interest on the debt. The debt just hit $37 trillion. They're spending about 22% of tax revenue to pay interest on that debt. You don't have to go back in time all that far, and people that are even in their mid 30s, they sort of lived through this. People who are in their 40s and 50s will probably remember this. In the early 90s, in 1991, the U.S. government was spending 27% of tax revenue just to pay interest. So it was a far worse problem. The national debt was a lot lower, but it was like everything was less. Tax revenue was less, GDP was less. So sort of looking at it proportionally through the lens of inflation and all this stuff, it was actually a much worse problem back then, simply because interest rates were higher. This was a result of interest rates in the 1980s being like, 15%, 16%. So oh my God, just imagine if the U.S. government was paying 16% interest a day. The government would be bankrupt immediately. So, in the 80s, you had 16% interest rates on U.S. government bonds. And so going into the 90s, they were spending 1991, fiscal year 1991, tax revenue. It took 27% of tax revenue just to pay interest on the debt. By the end of the decade, if you go to fast forward to 2000, they were down to basically 17%. So there was a significant decline. So the U.S. has been in this worse position before, just a couple of decades ago. The 90s weren't that long ago. And if you look at that and say they were able to reduce, if you look at the problem is the amount of money you have to spend on interest as a percentage of your tax revenue. So if you look and say, this is the problem that we're trying to solve for, 27% is way worse than what it is today. And they managed to bring that down. Right. And they managed to bring it down basically over the course of about 10 years, which for a government is not really that long. That's basically a single business cycle. So how did they do it? There wasn't single party control. You had plenty of years in there where you had a Democrat in the White House, Republican control of Congress. One house is one, the other house is another. So there wasn't any kind of plenty of years where there's no political unity whatsoever. This is also a time where, you had a lot of people in Congress who despised the president. Clinton got impeached, right? All that he was investigated, all this kind of stuff. So there are a lot of similarities there in terms of that inability, kind of a hatred between, multiple branches of government, all that sort of stuff. And yet they still managed to bring it down. How did they bring it down? Well, first and most importantly, they actually acknowledged the problem. The media acknowledged the problem. It became part of the public conversation, which is just simply not the case today. There is almost zero coverage, even in the, sort of the hallowed financial media, Wall Street Journal. These guys that are supposed to be the bulwark, supposed to lead the way in that conversation, are not doing it. There's no, to my opinion, the Wall Street Journal should be in the front page of the Journal every single day. Should be, this is a huge problem, nothing's being done about it. It should be in the editorial page every single day. And it's not. It's not. It's just not part of the public conversation. How high does this number need to go before it becomes part of the public conversation? In the early 90s, it was. People that are old enough probably remember Ross Perot, who was an American billionaire, legit. This guy built a massive business, had billions of dollars just sitting in the bank. And he ran for president, funded his entire campaign, put hundreds of millions of dollars of his own money, and he just bought TV time back when that was the medium. This guy bought TV time, and he got on TV with these like presentations, these slideshows. He had this hardcore text. Now this is how I'm gonna fix the debt. This is how I'm gonna cut spending. And this guy won like 10 or 15% of the popular vote, because it just gave you a sense of like how important this was in the American psyche of people realize like, man, we got to do something about this. This is a serious problem. And a lot of people went out and voted for this guy. What ended up happening, they elected Bill Clinton, who was like the opposite guy that you would expect to be fiscally conservative. And yet Bill Clinton, as a Democrat, was able to, even though he was hated by Congress and they didn't like his, a lot of things in his social agenda and all that, they still managed to work hand in hand. And this is also back when people, who were on different sides ideologically, people who were Democrats and people who were Republicans in Congress, they didn't, go and say, you're a threat to democracy, you're a racist, you're all these things. They actually found common ground. They acknowledged the problem and they worked together. And, ultimately, strategically, it wasn't really that big of a deal. They just said, there was not a single year where they cut spending. Not a single year. Every single year, government spending went up. They just sort of held it down. The growth rate in spending, they just held it down. They said, let's keep spending under control, and we'll let our economy just kind of do its thing. The U.S. economy is in great shape. We'll let the economy do its thing and grow. And it did. It was obviously the massive tailwind of the 90s was the internet boom, which created so much productivity and economic growth. And so if you look at like a 10-year period from fiscal year 1991 through fiscal year 2000, in that 10-year period, you had government spending increased. They did not cut spending. Government spending increased every single year. And through that 10-year period, spending increased by about 35%, which, is, that's actually not that much. When you adjust for inflation, over 10 years, the total inflation adjusted spending increase was just 5%, like 5.5% in total over 10 years. So averaging out to be like 0.4%, 0.5% per year for 10 years. That's it. So they let spending rise, but they put a cap on it, and meanwhile, they let the economy do its thing. You had this tailwind of the internet boom. So over that same 10-year period, tax revenue basically doubled. And so by the end of that 10-year period, they were still running deficits for the first 5 or 6 years. And then tax revenue increased so much, spending was still under control, and they started running budget surpluses. And year after year, they said budget surplus, and the budget surplus has got, to hundreds of billions of dollars, which was a lot of money back then. The biggest budget surplus they had was $237 billion. In fiscal year 2000, so basically 1999 and into 2000, that was a lot of money. That was a lot of money back then. It was really, that would be pretty good. That'd be an amazing budget surplus today. But back then it was an enormous amount of money. And so they didn't have to do anything radical. They didn't have to, cut Social Security or any of this kind of stuff. They didn't go and put people out on the streets or any of this sort of stuff. They just, they held spending down. They had some things going for them, which the United States doesn't have going today. The Cold War was over. So they actually did get to cut defense spending a little bit. They had what they called a peace dividend. You don't have that today. Back in the 90s, there was no arch nemesis. They didn't have, Russia was in tatters. China had not risen yet. The biggest threat that they had was Japan kind of coming up in the 80s and early 90s. But even by the mid to late 90s, the Japan scare was over. So there was no real,
speaking.
economically speaking, there was no economic nemesis, nipping at your heels, breathing down your throat. You didn't have so many other countries in the world that were calling for an end to the US dollar as the reserve currency. There was no alternative in the 90s to the US dollar. And so you had all these things. And you also had, in the late 90s, you had a massive financial crisis in Asia, in these, emerging markets that really was like quite localized there, that didn't have anywhere near the kind of impact on the US economy as it did in these emerging markets and so forth. So the US really, you also had like years and years where there was no national emergency, there was no major war, there was no, they didn't have any pandemic, they didn't have anything like that. So they had a stroke of good luck over that 10-year period as well. But it started with acknowledging the problem and people just getting together with sensible, common sense solutions. The concern I have is that right now, nobody's acknowledging that problem. Nobody is bringing this problem into public discourse to say, this is more important than transgender bathrooms. This is more important than who takes a knee at the national anthem, or, a lot of these things that people are, kind of freaked out about, because it concerns every single person alive in the United States of America. Whether you're a retiree or a newborn baby, this will have an impact on your life if they don't solve the problem. The debt will cause inflation if left unchecked. This is almost guaranteed. History is very inflationary. Throughout 5,000 years of human history, the consequence of government financial mismanagement is almost always inflation, and a lot of it. And so it will affect virtually everybody alive in the United States, and a lot of people who use dollars or rely on dollars outside of the United States as well. So it's a massive problem, and it needs to be addressed. It's not rocket science. They could actually have the will to do so. I just don't see they have the will to do so. So instead, what are they doing? They're saying, let's go hijack the Fed. The White House is saying, let's take our guys and put them on board in the Federal Reserve so they cut rates so we can, borrow money really cheap. You shouldn't be thinking about borrowing money at all. You should be thinking about, how do I cut spending and how do I manage the money that I'm getting better? And I just don't see anybody doing it. I mean, they had Doge and they chased Elon out of town. Elon said, hey, we can come up with hundreds of billions of dollars of cuts. And they chased this guy out of town. And they said, hey, we have an opportunity. We're going to pass this big omnibus spending bill. We have an opportunity to cut spending. No, instead they raised spending. So, there's literally no sign right now that we see that there's any appetite to do any of this. And the clock's ticking, man. The clock is ticking.
So you don't think it's a 1992 moment? I was going to say, because Elon Musk at least is trying to bring it into the public mind. And if he can't run for president, he could be the Ross Perot figure that shakes up the elections in the years to come. But AI even could be the internet of the modern age to kind of bring that tailwind in. But you're saying that the trajectory is just wrong.
Those are the similarities, right? You've got a president that's at odds with another party, the two parties that hate each other's guts. You've got a guy like Elon who sort of did what Ross Perot did. Ross Perot got 10 or 15% of the American public behind him. I think Elon's probably got more than that. Would be my guess. You've got some, there's been some drive to try and cut spending. There are some similarities, but the biggest one obviously also being that this technological headwind that is or tailwind that's making it easier for the economy to grow and so forth. So you got a lot of similarities there. Some differences. You don't have the peace dividend. You don't have the complete lack of economic adversary. You don't have the same sort of acceptance of the dollar as the global reserve currency. There's a lot of things. You don't have. They didn't have to worry about China invading Taiwan back then. All these different things that they didn't have to think about or worry about back then that they do have to worry about now. You already have people that are thinking, oh, we got a plan for the next pandemic and all this sort of stuff. So are you going to get 10 years now without a major emergency, without a major war, without a pandemic style event? Are you going to get 10 years like that? I don't know. But I mean, there's a lot of challenges, and I just don't see anything really right now for the people in power that make me think that they're taking this problem seriously, and they absolutely have to do so.
So then it comes down to individuals to protect mostly against inflation, or other things that you would have to make sure.
Yeah, D, all of the above. Anytime you've got a country that's heading down, going in the wrong direction economically, and it's so obvious, you can make that case for the U.S. very easily. Again, simply because we've done this before. You fast forward 8 years on this trajectory, you're spending north of 40% of tax revenue to pay interest on the debt. Social Security, its biggest trust funds have run out of money. Probably got a lot of countries around the world that have, at a minimum at least, significantly curtailed their use of the U.S. dollar. So the dollar's reserve status is on the ropes, which makes interest rates go up even more, which just creates more and more, it just compounds the problem. That's 5-8 years away. That's what we're dealing with, right? So that's the timeline to try and get this under control. I'm not sitting here saying that the world's come to an end. There's a lot of people on the internet that say, "Oh, it's the end of the world is nigh," and all this sort of stuff. I mean, they use words like collapse and these sorts of things, and I think that's naive, and I don't use that language because I think it's ignorant. I also think it's just too non-specific. I think it's emotional, and it leads people down an emotional path. And this is not a time to be emotional. This is time to be very rational. You have a problem. What are the ways to solve the problem? So the problem is you've got a country that's heading in the wrong direction. They're not doing anything about it. What are the consequences of that problem? Well, you've got economic consequences. The primary economic consequence is inflation. I mean, again, this is not, you don't have to be a PhD in economics. This is basic history. It's almost always inflationary. And we've talked a lot about how do you solve a problem like this? You have to rely on the Federal Reserve to print lots and lots of money, and that's inflationary. We found this out during the pandemic. The Fed printed $5 trillion. We got 9% inflation. If the Fed has to print $20 trillion to bail out the Treasury Department, how much inflation are you going to get then? Nobody knows, but it's probably not going to be zero. So if you're going to have an inflationary problem, what are the things that we can do now to solve that? Well, we talk about that a lot. It's, what does well during inflation? Real assets. Turns out there's a lot of real assets that are very cheap. There's a lot of businesses in the real asset space that are, profitable, productive companies that are, that are making a lot of money, that are paying dividends by producing or generating real assets, that are trading for, 2 or 3 times earnings, trading for less than book value. I mean, they're just giving these things away right now. And so those are things that are probably going to do extraordinarily well in an inflationary environment. So a little bit of a hedge in some of these could go a long way in hedging the negative consequences of inflation. There are other potential consequences to think about as well. I think whenever you see countries heading in the wrong direction economically, what do you find? You find a lot of internal ideological conflict. You find a lot of, social problems, rise in crime, I mean, cities and states, they have to cut back on public services. So you have, less of a police department. I mean, now you have people that are actually actively trying to defund the police, which is about as brilliant as saying, let's defund the fire department. We can see what happened in LA as a result of that earlier this year. I mean, there's a lot of these things that you start seeing the social consequences of the economic challenges. And you'll find yourself probably paying a whole lot more property tax, but getting your child getting a worse education, less police service, less fire service, all these different things, rising crime and so forth, and just general ideological tensions. You'll find a lot more probably mostly peaceful protests, and we're just out trying to enjoy your day, and some marauding crowd of idiot protesters getting in your face, wanting you to pump a fist, or all these different things. I think we'll probably see more and more signs of that social chaos that we've seen a lot of. I think you'll probably see, I mean, it's like little stuff. It's this kind of thing where you get on an airplane and basically have to expect to sit on the runway for 45 minutes because air traffic control can't get its act together, because of government funding, because of protests, because the people went on strike, because they didn't get their pay raise this year. The kinds of things you see in Europe a lot where, it's like all of a sudden the transit workers go on strike, the garbage workers go on strike, which I don't know if it's over, but I know it happened just recently in the city of Philadelphia. There's the garbage piles up. These are sorts of things that you see socially as a result of the economic consequences, but it starts with the economic consequences. And you have a strong and healthy economy, it's just far less likely that people want to go out in the streets and hold up signs and protest and do all these silly things when you have a really, really, really strong economy. It's when times get tough that people resort to these things. They resort to crime, et cetera. So those are the consequences that I think we see coming. And if you look at those potential consequences, there's things that you can do to plan on that. You probably want to think about, geez, if my city becomes unlivable because you've got zillions of homeless or migrants or mostly peaceful protesters or massive unemployment or whatever, what would I do? Where would I go? Maybe I want to go somewhere else because the city socially has become a bit of a cesspool. Maybe I want to think about other place to go. Maybe for my kids, I want to go somewhere else so they can have a better life, a better education, a safer upbringing, a more traditional upbringing, like a lot of us remember when we were kids. So these are things to sort of think about, but to think about them rationally, not emotionally. And I think, this is frankly a very, very good time to do that because it's, I think relative calm right now, as wacky and sort of chaotic as things might be. I think we could be looking at things that are a lot more chaotic a few years down the road.
Well, and then also the U.S. goes through these waves. We went through this woke wave, which maybe seems to be ebbing. We went through the whole Occupy Wall Street phase. And I feel like at those times, you can feel like the world is sort of not on your side and you can feel very alone and that everybody disagrees with you. And is everybody a socialist now? And suddenly you can't talk about things with a friend group because everybody's like, yeah, maybe Bernie is the answers.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we saw over the last couple of years exemplifies that. I mean, the era, the pandemic era, you weren't allowed to say anything about Black Lives Matter. You weren't allowed to say anything about vaccines. You weren't allowed to say anything about masks. You weren't allowed, you get canceled off the internet for this stuff. You could lose your job. I mean, you weren't allowed to open up your mouth and say anything. And so I do think it's important, having certainly, yes, a trusted network of like-minded people that understand you, that actually think similarly. It's not to create an echo chamber. It's just to have, I mean, I look at my kids. My kids are very, very, very young. We had a bunch of people over at the house this weekend, and it's great. It's like, oh, you're about my size. Let's play, and it's all great. It's a lot harder to do when you're an adult. It's a lot harder to sort of build relationships, trusted friendships and those sorts of things. It's a lot harder to do. It's one of the reasons, we've gone out of our way for years to try and do that, try and facilitate that. We created something within our organization a long time ago. We call it Total Access, and it really just to try and bring together groups of people. So I think, there's some of these things around on the internet. Some people call them masterminds. I don't like that term because it just sounds, I don't know, it just sounds weird to me. But I mean, it's Total Access is just a group. It's a group of people. It's our most exclusive group within our organization, within our community. And I've met some very, very close friends, people that even gone on to become not only really close friends, but even business partners, within this group. But I mean, it's just really great to see how the group itself connects with one another. We do these events, man, and it's like family reunions. I mean, people showing up, and it's all, hugs and kisses and things like that. So it's a thing probably within our organization that I'm personally probably most proud of. There's a lot of things I'm proud of. And when I go back and look at a lot of the calls that we've made since, since 2010, 2009, when did we start the company? I mean, Peter's been making
2009,
way before that. I mean, and just the general trajectory. I was looking at the other day at this slide that I had that basically summarized the entire ethos that I put on in a meeting that we had, an event we had in 2011. And I'm like, this is what I think is going to happen. And I was looking at it the other day going, holy shit. I mean, it's, basically exactly kind of how things have panned out. And I'm proud of that, but I'm really proud of the networks that have been built here, and the friendships and the relationships that have been built. And it's really, really great. So, we actually keep it closed very deliberately, trying to keep it relatively small. We do open it from time to time. We're actually opening up now. So, if people are kind of in that mindset of like, hey, I feel kind of isolated, a lot of people feel that way, honestly. And this is, our group is one way maybe to feel a little bit more connected, a little bit less isolated, a way to kind of speak your mind. We do a lot of really cool stuff, honestly. Like we do events, we do conferences, and we've had, talk about Robert Kiyosaki earlier. He's been to a bunch of our events. Ron Paul's been to a bunch of our events. Jim Rogers, we've had, just so many people like over the years that have been to our events. We've done them all over the world. We've done a lot of them in the U.S. From good old Dallas, Texas to freaking Uzbekistan, Singapore, Chile. We've done events all over the world, and they're a ton of fun. They're really great. We did one. We had Mexico City. We had the former president of Mexico not long ago. We did one in Panama not too long ago. I mean, they're really great. We also do some really fun kind of smaller trips. So not like kind of conference style, but smaller trips with smaller number of people, 10, 15, 20 people, where we go to really great places. They just did one. There's just one in Istanbul, and we put these trips together with our people, our staff. I want to go to the one in Argentina myself. We just want one in Istanbul where, it's like a small group of people just going, and it's like a little bit of mix of business and pleasure. There's one coming up next month in Africa. And so they're going, on safari and hitting the beaches of Zanzibar and all these really cool exotic things, but also meeting with very prominent business executives in Tanzania to actually kind of get a boots on the ground, hands-on frontier market experience and just kind of seeing what's out there. We did one, we've done these before. I mentioned we did one in Uzbekistan where we kind of did a train ride down the Silk Road, but also met with prominent business executives. Actually came away with a really interesting an investment opportunity out of that. There's one next year we just launched to Argentina. Talk about a turnaround story. This is a country that was in hyperinflation, and they just posted a budget surplus for the first time in like decades, and they've really managed to turn their story around. So it can happen. It can absolutely happen. And so we're going to Argentina. They actually have an economic citizenship program. We think Argentina is going to be one of the more valuable passports in the world. Thinking about a second passport is a really smart thing to do. We do a lot of that with our Total Access members. We actually have exclusive deals with some countries that offer economic citizenship programs to make it basically one of the most cost-effective ways in the world to do that. There's an economic citizenship program coming up in Argentina, so we're going to kind of tour that, looking at real estate, different investment opportunities, and hitting the Teatro Colón to go and see a really kind of fancy opera night, basically hiking in the beautiful vistas of Bariloche. With some it's all about building community, building relationships with people that just kind of have a similar view of the world, and that means a lot when you just sitting around a fire, drinking a really great glass of wine, and just being able to speak your mind about anything. It just, it means a lot. It means a lot. And so we try and facilitate that. So I just wanted to put it out there and let people know that we're opening that. It's definitely worth, for me, it's just the most wonderful thing about this organization. I just love it. I love hanging out with the members, and I hope some people choose to join us.
Thanks, James. Probably a good place to end it for today.
Okay. Hey, thanks for listening, everybody.